Why did one of Rome's greatest generals, whose entire career depended on discipline and foresight, nearly walk headlong into death in the quiet shadows of a Roman night? And more importantly, what would have happened if Caesar had been cut down before the famous Ides of March, before the empire itself had even solidified? This is where our story begins, in a tense moment few recall but which carried consequences so vast that the entire trajectory of Western history might have changed. Before we dive in, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content like this. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's go. Picture Rome in the year 44 BC. It is a city swollen with triumph and unease, filled with marble trophies and the thunder of ambition. Julius Caesar has returned from his string of astonishing victories, Gaul crushed, Pompey defeated, Egypt subdued, and the Republic's enemies scattered across 3 continents. In sheer military terms, his ascendance is unrivaled. Yet in political terms, his position is far more precarious. Rome is a place where daggers are as common as decrees, and where a man may command 40 legions in the morning, only to meet death at the hands of supposed allies before nightfall. Already Caesar has survived countless brushes with mortality, from his capture by pirates during his youth, to the storm-lashed campaigns in Gaul, to the desperate gamble of crossing the Rubicon with but a single legion. Each chapter in his life has been a wager against overwhelming odds. Yet on this night, the night we focus upon, it wasn't barbarian resistance, nor foreign kings, nor even a Pompeian army that endangered him. It was the men closest to him, fellow Romans bound not by loyalty, but by jealousy and fear. But before plunging into the shadows of conspiracy, we must ask, why did Rome ever allow one man to grow so powerful? The answer lies in decades of systemic weakness within the Republic. The Senate had grown myopic, elites squabbling over privileges rather than managing Rome's expanding empire. While senators clung to tradition and titles, generals gathered something far more tangible, armies personally loyal to them. This was Caesar's true weapon, not simply his genius as a tactician, but the loyalty of hardened men who'd marched with him through mud, snow, and terror. Yet the same power that bound thousands of soldiers to his cause also kindled suspicion in Rome's patricians. They saw not a servant of the state but a king in all but title. So consider this question. If you were among those senators, watching Caesar consolidate honors, consulships, priestly offices, dictatorial appointments, would you trust that his ambition had limits? Or would you conclude that to preserve the Republic, you had to act before it was too late? Some decided on the latter, and thus Rome drifted toward one of the most infamous assassinations in world history. But our story today does not begin with daggers in the Senate House. It begins with uneasy murmurs and a far less famous plot, a conspiracy whispered in darkened atriums where loyalty and treachery mingled uneasily. History remembers the Ides of March, but Caesar very nearly fell earlier, in a forgotten night where knives were almost unsheathed, where history teetered on a knife edge and then, strangely, stepped back. Historians record the hesitation, the chance delay, the omens ignored. And in that delay, Rome's destiny was preserved. To appreciate the magnitude of that moment, we must retrace Caesar's path, an audacious career built at the tip of a gladius. Raised amid political turbulence, nephew of the reformer Marius, young Caesar was marked early as a threat to Sulla's conservative order. He survived proscription, exile, capture, even ransom by pirates whom he personally promised, and later ensured, would taste crucifixion. From the start, his life was defined by defiance and a relentless pursuit of dominance. These formative experiences taught him a lesson he carried throughout his career: survival is earned not by meekness, but by boldness. His decision to cross the Rubicon years later was not a reckless plunge but the consistent application of that principle. By the time of the Civil War, Caesar's strategic brilliance was undeniable. At Pharsalus he turned Pompey's cavalry advantage into devastation with his now famous hidden reserve. At Alexandria and Zela, he improvised rapid campaigns with astonishing mobility, striking before enemies could coordinate. And always his soldiers adored him, for he shared their hardships, rewarded their courage, and inspired loyalty with charismatic speeches. For them, Caesar embodied Rome itself. For many senators, however, he embodied betrayal of the Republic. And there lies the paradox. The very traits that secured him command over armies destined him for conflict with his peers. So on the night in question, before the Ides, the conspirators had gathered. They were men of noble lineage, senators, former allies, some even kin by marriage. They had watched with unease as Caesar accepted the title of Dictator Perpetuo. Dictator in perpetuity, breaking one of the Republic's iron taboos. They had heard murmurs of crowns floated before him, rumors that he wished openly to become king, an offensive title to Roman ears. For the Romans had expelled their kings centuries earlier and built their republic on that proud memory. To them, Caesar was marching not toward leadership but toward tyranny. Yet here is where the situation grows razor-sharp. Eliminating Caesar was no simple matter. This was not a frail politician moving about without guard. This was Rome's greatest general, whose veterans lingered in the city, whose popularity among the masses could erupt into rioting if he were struck down. Thus any plot required not only courage but precision. The conspirators debated, better to strike him at an intimate banquet, where he would be unguarded, or on his journey to a Senate session, where custom forbade his lictors from bearing arms. Each angle carried risk. Each delay frayed nerves. And on this night, as Caesar prepared to meet them, the plan was close to being set in motion. But history is full of hesitation. Reports say that illness delayed him, perhaps even omens whispered to remain home. Perhaps superstition saved him, or sheer chance. Whatever the cause, the conspirators relented, postponing their strike. Caesar lived another day, and the murder would not come until the fateful Ides. Imagine, however, if the hesitation had broken the other way. Imagine if Caesar had fallen quietly, not publicly, not upon the Senate floor but in a private chamber, cut down unseen. Would his death have sparked popular outrage? Would Antony or Octavian have risen then as swiftly, or would the Republic have staggered onward in some deformed survival? This, dear viewer, is the tantalizing speculation. For history's great turning points are often accidents of timing, no less critical than battlefield maneuvers. Now, as we hold this moment suspended, we must appreciate how fragile the path truly was. Caesar was not invincible. He was flesh and blood, just as vulnerable to betrayal as any other Roman senator. But the Republic itself was also vulnerable, for even had he died that night, the divisions, the militarization, and the erosion of the Senate's legitimacy would have persisted. Caesar was not the disease, he was the symptom brought to its violent climax. What follows in our journey is the deeper exploration of the system that produced him, the Roman military machine, the instrument by which Caesar ascended and by which conspirators measured the consequences of their decision. For to understand why Caesar nearly fell, and why many hesitated to complete the act, we must first understand the fearsome power of the organization that stood behind him. Rome was not just a city. Rome was an army. And Caesar, more than anyone else of his age, knew how to wield it. So the question remains, and it is one I leave you with as we transition: if you had been there, in the hush of that night, your name scratched upon the wax tablet of conspirators, your dagger sharpened, your republic imperiled, would you have struck? Or would you, like so many Romans, have paused, hesitated, and thus allowed Caesar yet again to survive? In history, hesitation is as decisive as action. In this single heartbeat of delay, Rome's destiny was preserved. And in that preservation lay both the glory and the ruin of an empire to come. Why did Caesar's enemies fear him not just as a man, but as an institution? The answer lies in the engine that carried him across Gaul, across civil wars, across the span of the Mediterranean, the Roman legion. Far more than an army, it was a system of war perfected by centuries of adaptation, refinement, and ruthless practice. To understand how Caesar nearly reshaped the world, and why conspirators hesitated to strike him earlier, we must first understand the terrifying military machine that stood behind his name. The Roman legion was not a collection of mercenaries. It was Rome itself, armed and ordered into disciplined formations. At its core lay the centuries, groups of 80 fighting men led by centurions, those scarred veterans whose authority came not from noble birth but from demonstration of ferocity on the battlefield. 10 centuries formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts structured a legion, around 5,000 men when mustered to full strength. This organization gave Rome its flexibility, able to operate in small detachments, or to move as an overwhelming block of manpower. Compare this to their enemies, Gauls, Germans, Parthians, whose war bands often relied on chieftains' charisma or cavalry's sudden charge. Rome had studied chaos and turned war into a science. It trained cohesion into muscle memory. Training was merciless. Recruits were handed swords of double weight, shields of heavier wood, javelins thicker than regulation. For months they drilled with weapons that exhausted them, until when they lifted their real arms, they felt suddenly swift and strong. They marched 20 miles burdened with packs weighing as much as 80 pounds, and upon arrival, ordered to dig entrenchments before they could even rest. The lesson was driven in daily: discipline before comfort, order before fatigue. Any hesitation, any laxity, was beaten out, and in dire cases, punished by decimation, every 10th soldier executed by his comrades, a ritual so horrifying that memories of it kept men aligned even in desperate times. Here's the tactical brilliance. A Roman commander could maneuver whole legions on the field much like a chess master controls pieces, knowing that his men would not fragment in panic. Their discipline was so ingrained that when Caesar called upon them for double marches, to cross rivers where no enemy expected, or to build bridges in mere days across the Rhine, they obeyed without question. This obedience was his greatest weapon. Consider the German tribes he faced, warriors individually magnificent, taller than Romans, ferocious in fury. Yet fury breaks when its momentum stalls. Rome's wall of shields absorbed the shock like iron absorbing fire, and then advanced, step by grinding step, until discipline suffocated bravery. It wasn't brute strength that won Caesar his empire, it was organization. Weapons themselves played crucial roles. The pilum, the Roman heavy javelin, carried an ingenious innovation. Its thin iron shank would bend upon impact, rendering both the javelin useless for the enemy and encumbering a shield if it stuck there. This forced opponents to drop protective gear at the worst possible moment, just as a Roman infantryman closed in with his gladius, the sharp, stabbing short sword designed for close combat. While barbarian swords were often long, slashing weapons demanding space, the gladius was merciless in crush. Roman soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder, thrusting upward into the gut or downward through thigh, each stroke calculated, drilled, rehearsed until death itself became mechanical. The legion's arsenal did not stop at handheld weapons. Behind the lines loomed its engineering. Caesar's siege works at Alesia remain legendary: miles of circumvallation walls, ditches, palisades, towers, erected in weeks to encircle Vercingetorix within, while at the same time protecting against allies outside. This double-ringed entrapment was not simply brute force, it was strategic strangulation. Rome won wars not only by killing men but by crushing the will to resist through sheer logistical superiority. But here's the question worth pondering: given such immense military power, why would any Roman senator dare hatch plots against Caesar? Because they knew that the machine was loyal to him, not to them, not even to Rome's republican institutions. Soldiers adored Caesar because he marched beside them, addressed them not as dirt but as comrades, awarded spoils generously, and never shrank from sharing danger. This was loyalty more terrifying than any weapon. For conspirators, killing Caesar meant poking the bear of tens of thousands of hardened soldiers who carried nothing but devotion to his name. Could Brutus or Cassius have convinced such men that they murdered their general for principle? Or would the legions have turned Rome into rivers of blood and vengeance? This was the hesitation behind every whispered scheme. Consider Caesar's use of speed. During his Gallic campaigns, he would cover 80 miles in 2 days, relocating entire legions faster than barbarian scouts believed possible. Armies thought safe suddenly faced Roman steel at dawn. Logistics, the dull mathematics of warfare, became his sharpened blade. He calculated rations, pack animals, river crossings with precision rivaling any modern general. When he crossed the Rubicon with his single 13th Legion, he gambled against Pompey's larger forces, but he relied on his soldiers' unshakable trust in his pace. Speed, surprise, discipline, this triad became his hallmark. The consequences were immense. By Civil War's end, Caesar possessed not just conquered territory but an army whose loyalty eclipsed civic duty. The Roman military machine had become personalized, bound not to a senate, not even to Rome's laws, but to the charisma and rewards of one man. This, in the long term, spelled the Republic's doom. Every general after Caesar, from Augustus to Constantine, would inherit armies more loyal to individuals than to ideals. Once armies became crown-makers, republics became archaic illusions. But in Caesar's time, this loyalty cast shadows upon the conspirators. Imagine yourself among them. You wield a dagger, believing you defend liberty. Yet outside the city, 2 legions encamped, singing Caesar's praises. Strike him down, and tomorrow they march to avenge him. Do you hesitate? Of course you do. Hesitation defined the night his life was nearly extinguished. The assassination required not just courage, but perfect timing. Timing they missed. If evidence is needed of this military dominance, archaeology provides it. Excavations at Alesia reveal ditch systems, spikes, trenches layered for kilometers, confirming Caesar's written accounts once thought self-glorifying exaggerations. At Pharsalus's battlefield, remains of weaponry align with his maneuvers, showcasing how he broke Pompey's cavalry. Coins across the empire bore triumphal symbols, not subtle records but bold propaganda, shouting that military success justified Caesar's unmatched authority. These were tangible reminders for Romans: oppose Caesar, and you oppose the very walls, bridges, and weapons he wielded. Strategically, the machine offered not just conquest but a deterrent. When Caesar returned from Gaul, laden with immense wealth, his veterans marched alongside him, constructing loyalty even within city streets. Senators feared openly opposing him lest mobs erupt or soldiers unsheathed steel. This tension explains why conspirators plotted discreetly. They could never confront him directly when shielded by his machine. They sought moments of ritual and custom, like Senate gatherings, when guard was lowered. The legions loomed always in the background, silent but decisive arbiters of politics. So, what can modern thinkers learn here? Armies that become instruments of individuals, rather than servants of institutions, transform states into fragile monarchies in waiting. Caesar's Rome teaches us that no republic can long survive where military loyalty bends toward the charisma of one man. It becomes inevitable that opposition will either kneel or assassinate. This cycle repeats across history, from Caesar to Napoleon, to 20th-century strongmen whose armies saluted the individual above the nation. Thus the Roman legion was more than a body of soldiers. It was the silent character in our story, the ever-present titan standing at Caesar's shoulder. Its discipline gave him victory. Its loyalty gave him unchecked power. And its looming presence filled would-be assassins with dread. One could kill a man, but could anyone kill a machine forged out of iron, sweat, and ambition? That was the impossible question Rome faced in 44 BC. And so we see, Caesar's most dangerous night, the one before the Ides, was conditioned entirely by this machine. Conspirators wrung their hands not just over one ruler but over the thousands camped beyond the city gates. Killing Caesar under torchlight risked summoning the dragon. Deferring meant Rome itself remained hostage to his command. The night passed without blood. But the legions remained. Waiting. Watching. And soon, Caesar's victories and legions would lead him to the very scene where daggers finally found their mark. Why did Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general before Caesar, lose the battle that was his to win? And why did Caesar seize victory with an army outnumbered almost 2-1? The answer lies not only in sword and shield but in hesitation, decision-making under pressure, and the brutal calculus of leadership. The Battle of Pharsalus was not merely a clash of legions, it was the Republic itself in combat, 2 visions of Rome locked in a death struggle. By the summer of 48 BC, the civil war had reached its climax. Caesar had crossed into Greece in pursuit of Pompey, driven by the momentum of his daring Rubicon gamble. Pompey possessed the advantage in numbers, resources, and senatorial legitimacy. Nearly twice Caesar's infantry, a dazzling superiority in cavalry, and the backing of the Republic's wealthiest elites gave him every reason to wait, to starve Caesar out in hostile territory. Caesar, however, had something more elusive: seasoned veterans tempered by a decade of war in Gaul and absolute confidence in their commander's instincts. The battlefield chosen was near Pharsalus in Thessaly, open plains ideal for cavalry maneuvers. This favored Pompey, whose strength rested upon his mounted units. His advisers, Cicero among them, counseled caution. "Starve him, don't fight him," they urged. But Caesar pressed aggressively, deliberately burning supplies to force Pompey's hand. With senators demanding he crush Caesar decisively, Pompey consented to face him in open battle. It would prove the costliest concession of his life. Now let us place the armies. Caesar held roughly 22,000 infantry and a meager 1,000 cavalry. Pompey commanded nearly 45,000 infantry and almost 7,000 cavalry, 7 times Caesar's strength on horseback. On paper, the outcome looked inevitable. Pompey arrayed his legions in a wide line to stretch Caesar thin, anchoring his left flank with his massive cavalry wing. Caesar deployed in his typical 3-line formation but concealed a 4th line of 6 cohorts, veterans hand-picked for their discipline, and positioned them behind his small cavalry force on his right flank. Here lay his gamble: when Pompey's superior horsemen inevitably crushed his cavalry, his hidden line would strike. Why was this bold? Because using infantry to fight cavalry was unconventional. Normally mounted troops scattered foot soldiers with momentum and mobility. But Caesar recognized the weakness of Pompey's cavalry, proud young nobles more accustomed to parade than prolonged melee, untempered by years of Gallic slaughter. He trained his hidden line to fight in diamond-point thrusts rather than defensive squares, drilling them to stab not at riders' shields but at horses' faces and thighs. A brutal tactic, yes, but effective. Discipline and cruelty entwined. When the morning sun spilled across the plain, Caesar's men stood silent. He ordered them to hold, to wait as Pompey's larger force advanced. This was both psychological and tactical. Caesar deliberately delayed his charge so the enemy would exhaust themselves crossing the field. And in that silence, his army displayed unnerving confidence. Imagine the effect: Pompey's legions, vast in number, approach steadily. Caesar's outnumbered force remains motionless, as if certain of destiny. That confidence sapped Pompey's edge before steel even met steel. At last, the clash erupted. Javelins sailed, iron rang, the earth quaked under thousands of shields colliding. On the wings, Pompey unleashed his cavalry, surging like a tidal wave against Caesar's right. As expected, Caesar's cavalry faltered, wheeled back, feigned retreat. Pompey exulted, sure victory seemed seconds away. But then, in disciplined unison, Caesar's hidden cohorts snapped forward. They advanced at an oblique angle, jabbing upward into horses with precise, practiced thrusts. Panic spread through Pompey's noble cavalry. Horses collapsed, riders spilled, formation dissolved. Within minutes, Pompey's left wing disintegrated entirely, retreating in chaos. Caesar's right flank was saved. His ruse had worked. Meanwhile, in the center, both infantry lines locked in brutal contest. Caesar's thinner formation began to bend, but as Pompey's cavalry melted away, Caesar circled his reserves from the right, unleashing them upon the enemy's exposed flank. This was the decisive stroke. Pompey's massive advantage evaporated instantly. His soldiers, crowded and pressed, began to break. Caesar's men pushed relentlessly, stabbing, grinding forward just as they had against barbarian hordes. The front collapsed into carnage. Within hours, Pompey's great army was shattered. Now pause here and reflect. What would you have done in Pompey's place? His strategy seemed sound: leverage cavalry superiority to encircle Caesar. But he underestimated Caesar's capacity to innovate. He placed his faith in aristocratic riders against hardened legionaries drilled in unnatural but effective methods. Could Pompey have won by starving Caesar instead of fighting? Undoubtedly. But politics eroded his patience. Strategic indecision handed Caesar the opportunity. The human drama is just as compelling. Caesar, before battle, walked among his men, calling them each comrades. reminding them they fought not against Romans but for Rome itself. He promised no surrender, no return to exile and disgrace. For many, he was not just a general but a lifeline, a father figure. Pompey, by contrast, hesitated even during the clash, reportedly remaining at a distance rather than pressing decisive commands. His passivity sapped his troops' confidence. Soldiers can smell hesitation the way wolves sense fear. The consequences were catastrophic. Pompey fled from the field disguised, his prestige annihilated. Within weeks he sought safety in Egypt, hoping to rally forces. Instead, he was betrayed and murdered before reaching shore, his severed head handed to Caesar by men eager to court favor. Caesar, upon seeing it, reportedly wept, not only for a rival, but for a man entwined with his daughter Julia, long dead. Here the political and the personal collided with devastating force. It was not only the Republic that collapsed at Pharsalus, it was Caesar's own human network of alliances and affections. For Rome, the results could not be overstated. The Senate's legitimacy melted as its military hope vanished. Caesar stood unchallenged. Yet victory birthed new dangers. With Pompey gone, the only restraints upon him vanished, and suspicion about tyranny sharpened. In Rome's collective memory, Pharsalus became synonymous with Caesar's ascendancy, an almost supernatural demonstration of his military genius. Archaeological finds in Thessaly confirm the intensity of the clash. Arrowheads clustered in arcs that speak of cavalry collapse, coins minted soon after proclaiming Caesar's clemency for survivors. A propaganda masterpiece to mask the bloodshed. So ask yourself, why does this matter for the night Caesar almost fell? Because victories like Pharsalus gave him not merely power but aura, a myth of invincibility. For conspirators plotting in the shadows, every hesitation was magnified by the memory of moments like this battle, where Caesar twisted inevitable defeat into thunderous triumph. If he could snatch victory from Pompey, why not from them? The weight of his legend hung as heavy as his legions. Strategically, Pharsalus altered history's flow. The Republic's principle of compromise had already eroded, but this battle annihilated balance forever. Caesar proved that one man, with disciplined troops, could topple centuries of constitutional structure. The senator generals who followed would copy this playbook, until emperors rose in succession. In military terms, Pharsalus demonstrated not just tactical innovation but the supremacy of veterans' experience over raw advantage. In political terms, it was the death knell of shared governance. And yet the irony is stark. Caesar's triumph was also his trap. The greater his victories, the more suspicious the Senate grew, the more inevitable his assassination became. His aura of military invincibility shielded him on campaign but marked him for daggers at home. Talents that won empires inspired peers to plot his death. Pharsalus crowned his legend, and sealed his fate. So as we leave the battlefield of Thessaly, littered with Pompeian corpses and Roman glory, we return to Rome's simmering heart. Caesar survived spear and sword, but could he survive suspicion? Inside the Senate, passions boiled, jealousy festered, conspiracies thickened. Unknown to Caesar, while he raised monuments to triumph, friends sharpened knives. Pharsalus won him the throne in all but name. But victory on the plain of Thessaly ensured that somewhere, somehow, someone in Rome would choose to strike. The battlefield was silent, but the political war had only just begun. Why did Caesar, master of armies and genius of tactics, fail to see that the deadliest ground was neither Gaul's forests nor Thessaly's plains, but the marble halls of the Senate? Because in Rome, politics was war by other means. And just as battles hinge on timing, so too did the conspiracy that shadowed his last days. The aftermath of Pharsalus transformed Caesar from a contender into the undisputed master of Rome. Pompey was dead, the remnants of senatorial resistance scattered. Those who once wielded armies now approached him in supplication, offering oaths of allegiance. Caesar publicly embraced the language of clemency, presenting himself as magnanimous victor. He pardoned Cato's allies, spared Brutus, and even allowed Cicero to return to public life. Yet beneath this forgiving facade, a subtler transformation occurred. Caesar increasingly governed alone, with Senate ritual reduced to hollow performance. Offices that once rotated annually among Rome's elite now clustered around his person. He became consul year after year. He was named dictator, first temporarily, then for 10 years, finally for life. The Senate, that proud institution which traced its ancestry to the king's overthrow nearly 5 centuries earlier, now bowed beneath Caesar's shadow. To the masses, this mattered little. They adored him. Games, banquets, debt relief, and the promise of new colonies granted them land. For veterans, the loyalty was absolute. He had led them through hardship to reward. But for senators, Caesar was suffocating oxygen itself. He embodied not merely a political rival, but the destruction of a whole way of life. Political intrigue in Rome always arose from this tension between the practical loyalty Caesar commanded and the ideological nostalgia of aristocrats clinging to libertas, that cherished Roman idea of shared governance. Men like Marcus Junius Brutus, descended from the founder who expelled Rome's kings, could not stomach watching Caesar absorb powers that walked like monarchy, even if wrapped in republican titles. For Brutus, personal gratitude warred with ancestral duty. Caesar had not only spared his life after Pharsalus but promoted him to office. Yet every step Caesar took toward kingship whispered shame into Brutus's ears. Then there was Gaius Cassius Longinus, the hard-tempered senator who had once fought for Pompey. Caesar pardoned him too, but Cassius remained bitter, less philosophical, more visceral in his resentment. Where Brutus wrestled with ideals, Cassius wrestled with humiliation. He spit venom in conversations, whispering that Caesar aimed at a crown, that Rome once proud now bent like a client state beneath one man. Hatred like his does not sleep. It waits for daggers. What brought them together was not a single offense but an accumulation of slights and symbols. Caesar wore triumphal dress too freely, received flattery too openly, allowed priests to crown him in public processions. When the people shouted, "King of Rome!" he theatrically refused, but he refused in such a way as to remind them how near the dream was. To his soldiers, this was theater of inevitability. To senators, it was theater of insult. They knew their histories. The Republic had been forged in the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud, last king of Rome. Romans loathed kingship with ancestral hatred. By flirting with it, Caesar violated not just politics but tradition itself. What's fascinating, and terrifying, is how politics and military strategy intertwined. Caesar stood ready to depart for Parthia with an immense expedition, a campaign that promised wealth, glory, and the allure of avenging Crassus's disastrous defeat at Carrhae. That departure date became a ticking clock in every conspiratorial meeting. If Caesar left Rome with an army at his back, he would return a conqueror greater than Alexander, securing absolute dominance. If he could be struck at all, he must be struck before leaving. The Parthian campaign was not merely foreign policy. It was the ultimate countdown to dictatorship eternal. Thus the Senate's marble halls transformed into a battlefield of deception, as tense as any clash of arms. The conspirators met in secret, Brutus, Cassius, Casca, Decimus, Cinna, and others. They debated methods like military staff officers analyzing terrain. Should Caesar be killed in his home, where security might be lax? Or at public games, where the mob's chaos could conceal blades? The consensus congealed around the Senate House itself. For centuries, custom required that arms not be carried within its walls. Lictors left axes and rods outside, guards remained absent. Caesar, at his most vulnerable, would march into tradition's embrace with nothing but political dignity as shield. There the knives could strike. Let us imagine their meetings. In atriums lit by smoky lamps, voices hushed and eyes darting, noblemen weighed treachery as though judging logistics. They pledged not through vows of religion, but through necessity. Here is the human drama. Some, like Cassius, seethed with ardor. Others, like Brutus, quailed. It was Brutus's presence that lent legitimacy. If the descendant of the ancient Brutus, who expelled Rome's kings, joined the plot, then their murder could be dressed not as crime, but as sacrifice for freedom. Yet every conspirator knew they put themselves at mortal risk. A failed strike meant not only their own deaths but massacre at the hands of Caesar's legions. It was less a plan than a gamble, measured not in miles of terrain, but in seconds between drawing a dagger and finding Caesar unguarded. In politics, timing is terrain. Consider Caesar's position. Though powerful, he was cautious by nature. He distrusted omens less than most but paid them enough heed to delay decisions. He notoriously dismissed the warnings of the soothsayer Spurina, who allegedly cautioned him to beware the Ides of March. Yet even before that, other warnings circulated. Informants whispered of senators observing strange gatherings. Partial rumors trickled to Caesar's ears. What he never suspected, or perhaps refused to suspect, was the depth of treachery among his closest circle. Decimus Brutus, one of his companions entrusted with military commands, aligned with the plotters. Caesar may have thought assassins would come from old enemies. He had not reckoned that the blow would come from supposed friends. The Senate chamber thus became a trap disguised as ceremony. Invitations went forth for a session on the Ides to discuss governance before Caesar's departure for Parthia. Conspirators polished their excuses, their justifications. And they sharpened their blades. Each dagger was hidden beneath a toga fold, each assassin rehearsed where to stand. It was less poetry than logistics, akin to maneuvering units before battle. Caesar would be encircled, petitions presented, a mob of senators pressing forward, and then, in a single burst, steal. Yet in Roman politics, nothing is ever simple. Rumors spread beforehand. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, alarmed by omens, begged him not to attend. Caesar half listened. He knew the risk of stoking suspicion by absence, but his instinct to command overrode caution. So often he had succeeded by defiance. Why turn back now? This blend of audacity and dismissal was hallmark Caesar. The same man who crossed the Rubicon with 1 legion marched unguarded into a Senate session where 30 knives awaited him. Here ambition became weakness. Consider yourself in his position. Would you trust your colleagues after absolute victories? Or would paranoia consume you? Caesar chose pride over fear, and pride sharpened the conspirators' resolve. It is easy to see how he misjudged. Caesar thought himself untouchable, a man almost mythic after Pharsalus. He had turned disadvantage into advantage too many times to imagine final defeat. That very aura, the myth that deterred earlier plots, blinded him to this one. Politics now hardened into inevitability. The conspirators were not rash men. They calculated outcomes with the same cold arithmetic as generals measuring troops' strengths. By killing Caesar, they gambled not only on survival but on reviving the Republic. Whether naive or idealistic, they genuinely believed Rome could return to collective governance once he was gone. Archaeological records, coins minted proclaiming Id Mar, daggers flanking liberty caps, prove this belief. For Brutus and Cassius, the murder was not self-indulgence but branded as liberation. The irony could not be sharper. Their strike, intended to save the Republic, unleashed civil wars bloodier than any before. Their calculations missed one fatal element: Caesar's heir, Gaius Octavius, a youth of 19, waiting quietly and observing. The conspirators thought they removed a tyrant. What they removed was the last chance for compromise between Republic and Empire. Here lies the truth of Rome's political battlefield. Victory in intrigue, as in war, depends upon complete awareness of terrain, morale, timing, and aftermath. The senators executed tactics with precision, yet failed strategy utterly. They killed the man, but not the system he embodied. They underestimated the power of loyalty among his soldiers, the grief and rage of the public, and the ambition of his successors. To defeat Caesar on the field of politics required more than daggers. It required answers to the vacuum he left. Answers they never possessed. And so the night that Caesar almost fell before the Ides haunts us. Hesitation delayed his earlier murder, caution collapsed into ritual. By the time the daggers truly struck, the decision was too late to restore the Republic. But as we turn from whispers of conspiracy toward public life, we must ask, how did ordinary Romans experience this turbulence? For how soldiers, citizens, and slaves lived amid Caesar's rise might explain why his death, rather than liberating, plunged the world into greater turmoil. Why did ordinary Romans tolerate Caesar's rise to near absolute power when many senators despised it? The answer lies not only in his military brilliance but in how conquest reshaped daily existence, redefining what it meant to be Roman. Caesar's story is not just one of generals and conspirators, but of citizens, soldiers, slaves, and provincials whose lives were bent by the empire's ambitions. To understand the roots of loyalty and resentment, we must step out of the Senate chamber and into the streets, the camps, and the provinces that Rome governed. The expansion of Rome under Caesar's leadership, and in the generation before, was breathtaking. Gaul was subdued, Spain consolidated, Egypt made pliant, North Africa stabilized, the eastern provinces knit into the republic's economy as tributaries. But conquest was more than foreign policy. It was cultural engineering. Caesar and his peers understood that Rome could not simply crush peoples. It had to integrate them into the vast apparatus of citizenship, taxation, and loyalty. Thus, the legion was not just Rome's hammer, it was its assimilation tool. In Gaul, cities like Lutetia, modern Paris, and Lugdunum, Lyon, flowered with Roman roads and aqueducts soon after conquest. Archaeological remains show Roman-style amphitheaters rising beside Gallic temples, hinting at how new subjects were offered entertainment, while their sacred sites were gradually Romanized. Caesar's own commentaries, though propaganda, make plain his strategy: celebrate local elites who submitted, crush those who resisted without mercy. In return, Rome offered the lure of citizenship, a status coveted across the Mediterranean. For provincials, Rome was both oppressor and opportunity. Daily life for ordinary soldiers underscored this cultural gatekeeping. The Roman legionary camp was a microcosm of order. Each evening after a day's march, soldiers dug entrenchments and raised timber palisades in quadrangular layouts, streets laid so precisely that modern archaeologists can map identical patterns from Britain to Syria. Within this organization lay Rome's cultural continuity. No matter the soil, Rome replicated itself. Soldiers were not only warriors but builders, engineers, masons. Their daily lives wove Roman identity physically across conquered worlds. What did a soldier's day resemble? Awake at dawn, rations distributed, grain that each man milled into bread himself, or porridge thickened by whatever spoils were scrounged. Drills followed, grueling repetitions of shield walls, javelin casts, sword thrusts into straw dummies weighted to mimic flesh. March duty might call them down dusty roads, miles consumed with burdens heavy enough to break less disciplined men. In evenings, they constructed camps, repaired gear, or gambled with dice carved from bone. News from Rome traveled slowly, so rumors filled the gaps, stories of senators bickering over Caesar's fate retold by men who fought only to trust their general's next order. Loyalty was built in this shared hardship, in facing death together, in the limited comforts Caesar distributed: coin, foreign booty, the occasional feast. Contrast the soldier's grind with the citizen's rhythm inside Rome. The forum bustled each morning with lawsuits, trade, senatorial debates. Bakers kneaded wheat imported from Africa, oil merchants hawked amphora from Spain, cloth sellers dyed fabrics with Venetian purple. Senators strode in flowing togas. Plebeians jostled for grain doles at distribution points. Life was lived publicly, punctuated by spectacles, gladiator games, chariot races in the Circus Maximus, plays that satirized the same political figures plotting in the Curia. Romans loved theater, even as real political theater drowned their republic. Bred in circuses, Juvenal's line centuries later explains much. The plebeians tolerated Caesar's authoritarian drift because their bellies were filled and their thirst for spectacle quenched. Caesar understood this acutely. He financed lavish games, filled arenas with exotic animals, staged triumphs that paraded captive kings through the streets. Ordinary citizens could walk away exclaiming that under Caesar's rule, life felt grand, expansive, victorious. Political abstractions like libertas mattered far less when daily survival improved. In stark contrast, slaves bore the brunt of Rome's wealth. Millions of enslaved people, many seized in Caesar's Gallic campaigns, filled Roman households, mines, and farms. Their daily lives were grueling, stripped of freedom, yet they too facilitated Rome's cultural machine. Greek slaves educated aristocrats' children, introducing philosophies that senators later wielded to justify rebellion or support. Gallic slaves labored in fields, enriching patricians. Their resentment smoldered, occasionally erupting in revolt, but mostly absorbed, fueling Rome's economy silently. Caesar's victories thus reordered the households of Rome itself, as enslaved men and women from conquered lands mingled into streets and kitchens. Women, though politically excluded, navigated cultural shifts as well. Elite matrons gained influence through family alliances. Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, acted as confidant and was remembered for the ominous warnings she pleaded to her husband before the Ides. Wealthier women gained property rights under loosened republican laws, maneuvering in social spaces where marriage, dowries, and influence intersected. Common women carried daily burdens, fetching water, managing shops, raising families through instability. Their lives reflected Rome's paradox, a city glowing with glory yet teetering on violence. Class conflict underscored this entire world. Aristocrats mourned what they believed to be the Republic's decline, yet were beneficiaries of conquest's spoils. Plebeians cheered Caesar for debt relief and cheap grain but were pawns in elite power struggles. The urban poor surged at games Caesar funded, rewarded by spectacle, distracted from structural inequities. Citizens of provinces longed for citizenship because it offered tangible legal protections. Citizenship was not abstract, it meant immunity from execution without trial, rights of property, and inclusion in the imperial project. Caesar's willingness to extend citizenship incrementally won loyalty and built the empire's durability. He understood cultural carrots mattered as much as military swords. The cultural impact also changed identity itself. To call oneself Roman, by Caesar's era no longer strictly meant living in the city. It referred to adopting Roman law, language, and custom even thousands of miles distant. From Britain to Asia Minor, inscriptions reveal provincial elites proudly declaring themselves Romans, erecting statues and togas, funding amphitheaters. Caesar's conquests accelerated this diffusion. Rome was no longer simply a city-state, it was an idea carried in stone roads, Latin words, legal systems. And yet, the daily life of those who bore this transformation was not always comfortable. Archaeology uncovers contrasts. Elegant mosaics beside cramped insulae where tenement families packed into fire-prone wooden apartments. Streets thronged with vendors but lacked sanitation, cesspits overflowed, disease rampant. The ordinary Roman navigated filth and glory simultaneously. Caesar's Rome was dazzling yet precarious. So why does this matter for our broader story of conspiracy? Because the cultural loyalty Caesar built among ordinary citizens explains the conspirators' hesitation. Senators might sharpen daggers, but citizens adored him. Kill Caesar in the Senate, and you risk mobs storming the Curia. Kill him, and veterans grumble mutiny in camps. The very fabric of daily Roman life, its bread distributions, its games, its veterans rehoused in colonies, propped his power. Assassins calculating politics weighed not just Caesar's bodyguards, but the forces of culture aligned in his favor. As much as soldiers shielded him with loyalty, so too did bakers, market-goers, and plebeians who declared Caesar their champion. Consider also how Caesar's cultural policies fed strategic consequences. By integrating elites of conquered provinces, he fostered future allies like the Gauls who later would fight proudly under imperial banners. By offering Romanization, he expanded the human base of empire's durability. It was not simply conquests of terrain that mattered, it was conquest of identity. This lesson resounds across history. Empires endure not by military might alone, but by convincing the conquered that belonging offers more rewards than resisting. Yet within this growing system lurked contradictions. Daily inequities sharpened, aristocrats estranged, plebeians distracted, slaves resentful. The cracks widened even as the empire expanded. Caesar's balancing act, between the classes, between integration and control, could not hold forever. His cultural victories were as much accelerants to political explosion as they were stabilizers. And so, as knives gleamed in conspirators' homes, Rome's daily rhythm pulsed on, bakers kneading bread, soldiers drilling in camps, senators bickering even while plotting, children playing in streets lined with triumphal arches. It was this world, not the abstractions of liberty or dictatorship, that made Caesar dangerous. Because to millions of Romans, he was not merely a general or politician. He was Rome's provider, patron, and symbol of greatness. Remove him, and the entire delicate lattice trembled. Thus, the conspirators miscalculated not only the legions but also the masses. They understood military loyalty but not cultural allegiance. When Caesar died, they expected celebration. Instead, they unleashed chaos. For the ordinary Roman had tied his life to Caesar's bread, Caesar's games, Caesar's vision. And once betrayed, they turned upon the assassins with fury. So here lies the cultural paradox. Caesar's rise was fueled not only by blades, but by loaves, not only by legions, but by laws, not only by conquest, but by integration. And that is why the Senate's whispers were so dangerous, and so fateful. For as we turn next, we must ask, what was the turning point? Which moment transformed Caesar's political dominance from sustainable to fatal? Which act brought his temporary power into collision with destiny? The plot was seated not merely in Senate meetings or cultural strains, but in a climactic turning point whose consequences unraveled republic and birthed empire. Why did Julius Caesar, the man who marched through Gaul undefeated, who crushed Pompey at Pharsalus, who outmaneuvered kings and outlasted omens, fall not to armies but to daggers? And why did one earlier night, a near assassination before the Ides, prove decisive in tilting fate against him? This section explores the turning point, the convergence of hubris, hesitation, and human frailty that sealed both Caesar's destiny and the Republic's. Through the early months of 44 BC, Caesar's power was unparalleled. Dictator in perpetuity, consul yet again, high priest, master of legions, architect of colonies, he accumulated every office, every dignity, until republic's shared traditions seemed but ceremonial theater. Yet power exacted a price, mistrust sharpened with each honor. Senators accustomed to rotation of office watched him clutch them all. Then came the crown episode. Mark Antony, at the festival of Lupercal, offered Caesar a diadem before a cheering crowd. Caesar theatrically refused, perhaps twice, but the symbolism struck like thunder. To the people, it looked like flirtation with monarchy. To senators, it was confirmation of their worst fears. Kingship in Rome was not simply distasteful, it was antithetical to the republic's very identity. The refusal placated no one. Instead of reassurance, it created suspicion. Why allow the offer at all? Why stage the drama? Did Caesar test whether Rome would accept a king under another name? The Senate seethed. For Brutus, descendant of the man who expelled Tarquin the Proud, Rome's last king, the weight of ancestry pressed heavy. For Cassius, bitterness grew unbearable. For Decimus, long a confidant of Caesar, loyalty bent into treachery. The political tension, already taut, now quivered on the verge of violence. It is here, just before the Ides, that a chilling near assassination unfolded. We know fragments from later accounts, conspirators already poised, weapons sharpened, debating the moment. They nearly struck one night during a private gathering, when Caesar was expected to appear with limited guard. He was delayed, some sources whisper illness, others omens. Whatever the truth, hesitation froze daggers mid-sheath. Timing, in war and politics alike, is everything. That missed strike became the ominous prelude. Caesar survived one night too many. By living, he guaranteed the assassination would come more publicly, more decisively. Imagine yourself among them. In the atrium, cloaked, dagger hidden in your toga's folds. Caesar late to arrive. Minutes pass into hours. Each conspirator's heart beat louder than the next. And then word filters, he will not come tonight. Do you strike elsewhere or retreat? Retreat wins. A tiny decision, to wait for another day. That hesitation preserved history as we know it. Had Caesar died privately in shadow before the Ides, Rome's trajectory might have screamed in another direction entirely. Perhaps no Octavian, no Antony-Cleopatra wars, no Augustus to forge empire. One missed appointment became the hinge of civilization. The delay emboldened conspirators, but also stretched nerves. They recognized the clock ticking toward Caesar's planned departure for Parthia. Leave with an army, and he might return a monarch more glorious than Alexander. The urgency clicked. If the strike was to be meaningful, it had to be swift, public, symbolic. He must die not in bedroom secrecy, but in the Senate House, with Rome itself as witness. That shift, from assassination of inconvenience to assassination of spectacle, marked the true turning point. Meanwhile, omens and warnings multiplied. Ancient sources, Plutarch, Suetonius, relate fire-spitting beasts, strange lights, and prophetic murmurs. A soothsayer named Spurina allegedly warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia dreamed of his statue bleeding, hands grasping. She pleaded with him to remain home. Caesar, rational yet proud, wavered. On the morning of the 15th, he relented to her tears, agreeing at first to avoid the Senate. But then came Decimus Brutus, once loyal, now traitor, insisting that to shun the session would appear cowardly. He mocked omens as superstition, appealed to Caesar's pride, reminded him of his planned Parthian campaign. The Senate awaited him, honors ready. Would he insult them by absence? Here lies Caesar's fatal flaw. His entire career had been built on audacity, defying warnings, choosing boldness when others shrank. Crossing the Rubicon, storming bridges, marching with a single legion, all gambles that paid off. Why not dismiss superstitions now? Pride triumphed over prudence. He rose from his home and set out for the Curia. Every conspirator exhaled relief. The trap would spring. But let us return briefly to the strategic layer. In military science, the turning point is not always the decisive blow itself but the moment when momentum shifts irreversibly. At Alesia, it was the collapse of Gallic relief forces. At Pharsalus, it was Pompey's cavalry rout. For Caesar's life, the turning point was not the Ides dagger thrust, but the decision, after the failed earlier night, to walk into the Senate unguarded. That moment sealed his fate more than the stabs themselves. The conspirators prepared their battlefield meticulously. A Senate meeting scheduled at the theater of Pompey, whose annex housed the Curia. Custom forbade lictors' arms, ensuring Caesar would tread unprotected. Each conspirator positioned strategically like soldiers flanking prey. Casca tasked with the first strike. Brutus's presence a legitimizing shield. Cassius a relentless driver. Decimus the deceiver who ensured Caesar attended. The choreography resembled a military ambush more than a debate. Still, in Caesar's mind, the battlefield was secure. He trusted public setting as safeguard, his aura of invincibility as shield. He walked without hesitation. Consider the irony. Caesar believed himself safer amid the Senate than in barbarian forests. He misread terrain. He underestimated human betrayal. For a general whose genius was terrain analysis, logistics, morale, this was the single fatal miscalculation. On that final morning, accounts capture small yet poignant details. A scroll placed in Caesar's hand en route, allegedly warning of conspiracy, went unread. He tucked it without glance. Pride deafened him when prudence might have saved him. Inside, senators gathered. The conspirators' daggers glistened beneath folds. Petitions presented, distracting gestures brought him toward the circle. Then Casca struck first, though hesitating momentarily before plunging. Confusion, then frenzy, every conspirator stabbing, Caesar reeling, Brutus among them in final betrayal. The Senate chamber, symbolic heart of Republican liberty, soaked in dictators' blood. Yet the turning point had occurred earlier, that forgotten night of hesitation. On that earlier evening, had Caesar arrived, had sleepiness not intervened, the conspirators would have acted then. In darkness, with fewer witnesses, perhaps the Republic's fate might have shifted. The spectacle of Ides outraged people, generated martyrdom, and fueled civil war. Without spectacle, perhaps no cult of Caesar, no Octavian's rally to vengeance, no imperial dynasty. History hinged not on how Caesar died, but on when and where. The conspirators' early hesitation doomed the Republic as surely as Caesar's dagger wounds doomed him. So why does this matter? because history's pivotal moments are not always grand battles but subtle instants of indecision. A council delayed, an omen heeded or ignored, a sickness that cancelled dinner, all shape empires. Caesar's life pivoted in the heartbeat when conspirators stayed their hands. The Republic pivoted in the heartbeat when Caesar dismissed Calpurnia's pleas. These were not accidents, but products of character. Pride, hesitation, conviction, they are as strategic as cavalry wings or siege works. After the Ides, consequence unfolded rapidly. Chaos seized Rome. The Senate, far from restored, dissolved into factions. Antony seized Caesar's will, Octavian claimed inheritance, mobs rioted, veterans prepared vengeance. The conspirators, instead of hailed liberators, became fugitives within their own city. Their assassination was tactically flawless, strategically disastrous. They killed a man but birthed an empire. Octavian, not Caesar, would complete the transformation from republic to monarchy, but assassins paved his road. The turning point, therefore, is Janus faced, both the conspirators' earlier hesitation and Caesar's later pride. Each ensured the Ides would be not liberation but cataclysm. The Republic died not only in knives but in silence, the silence of a man who failed to read a scroll, of senators who failed to strike when chance first offered, of a city too enthralled to resist. Consider now what you would have done, had you been Decimus choosing whether to mock omens, or Brutus debating loyalty and ancestry, or Caesar weighing pride against caution. Each choice carved the tombstone on the Republic. History doesn't remember hesitation kindly, it remembers its consequences. The night Caesar almost fell matters precisely because it was not the night he did. That hesitation turned assassination into martyrdom, and martyrdom into empire. The turning point was less a blade than a moment missed. And with that miss, the trajectory of Western history bent irreversibly toward emperors, dynasties, and centuries of imperial rule. Why did Caesar's death not restore liberty, as the conspirators claimed, but instead plunge Rome into deeper wars and ultimately entrench monarchy? Because assassinating a man cannot assassinate the system he created. The true consequence of the Ides of March was less the end of Caesar than the birth of Caesarism itself, a political model that has echoed across 2 millennia. The immediate consequence was chaos. The Senate rang with terror, as Caesar's blood dried on the Curia floor. The conspirators, believing themselves liberators, marched through the streets crying, "Liberty!" But Rome was not celebrating. Crowds fled in fear, uncertain whether legions loyal to Caesar would descend. Caesar's funeral cemented their failure. Antony, once his loyal lieutenant, seized the stage in a speech that turned public grief into rage. He unveiled Caesar's bloodied robe, named the assassins, and recited Caesar's will, revealing monetary gifts to every Roman citizen. Instead of seeing his death as tyranny's end, the people saw it as betrayal of their benefactor. Riots ensued. Houses of conspirators were torched. Far from saviors, Brutus and Cassius became fugitives. Strategically, their act resembled a tactically brilliant strike that failed to consider follow-through. They succeeded in killing their target, but left the battlefield wide open for adversaries to seize momentum. Antony immediately moved to consolidate power, yet he underestimated another player, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son and heir. Barely 19, frail by appearance, Octavian was dismissed by veterans and senators alike. But his genius lay not in immediate force of arms but in patience and political awareness. He seized Caesar's name, wealth, and cause. Within months, legions rallied not to Brutus or Cassius, but to the boy they now called Caesar's son. The cycle of civil war spun again. The battles that followed, Philippi, Actium, were direct legacies of the Ides. At Philippi in 42 BC, Brutus and Cassius were crushed, both taking their own lives. At Actium in 31 BC, Octavian outmaneuvered Antony and Cleopatra, leaving himself sole master of Rome. The Republic was not reborn, it was finally and irreversibly dead. Octavian, renamed Augustus, inaugurated the Roman Empire, cloaking monarchy in republican titles. Caesar fell, but Caesarism triumphed. So what were the long-term consequences for the world? First, the shift from republic to empire institutionalized the personal army. Caesar broke the final taboo. Soldiers swore loyalty not to Senate and state but to one man. Augustus formalized it, binding the legions directly to emperor's service. From then on, Rome's fate was tied to the ambitions, or weaknesses, of individuals. Whenever an emperor faltered, rival generals rose with armies at their backs, plunging the empire into civil conflict. That template, born in late Republican Rome, resurfaced through history. Napoleon's Grande Armée, 20th century military dictatorships, even coup-prone modern states, all echo Rome's lesson: once armies attach to personalities over institutions, republics crumble. Second, Rome's cultural integration accelerated under imperial stability. Caesar had pioneered citizenship grants, Augustus expanded them. Provincial elites gained Roman identity as reward for loyalty. Archaeology confirms this. Towns in Gaul, Spain, North Africa filled with Roman-style villas and inscriptions by local governors calling themselves cives Romani, citizens of Rome. The empire persisted because it convinced elites that Romanization served their interests. This was Caesar's gift to Augustus, the blueprint of integration. By conquering territory and offering participation, Rome cemented far longer rule than conquest alone could allow. Without Caesar's vision, Rome may have fractured into feuding territories as earlier empires had. Third, the assassination shaped the politics of legitimacy for centuries. Augustus learned from Caesar's downfall. He carefully avoided crowns, insisted he restored the republic, called himself princeps, first citizen, rather than king. He painted autocracy in republican camouflage to disarm senators' resentment. Yet everyone knew the truth. The Senate yielded, and an emperor emerged. Caesar's death taught rulers everywhere that optics matter as much as armies. To seize overt monarchy was dangerous. To cloak it in tradition was genius. This lesson repeated itself across monarchies, from Byzantine emperors cloaked in Roman law to modern leaders who declare emergency powers while promising liberty. Caesar's fall thus became a textbook on how to rule without appearing to. Fourth, Caesar's assassination created a cult of personality rare in previous Roman politics. Before him, even great generals like Marius or Pompey did not inspire veneration after death. But Caesar's murder transformed him into a martyr. Temples rose in his honor, a divine star was proclaimed as omen at his funeral games. Eventually he was deified as Divus Julius. The precedent was seismic. No republican state can survive deifying its leaders. Once Caesar was a god, Augustus was his son of a god. From then on, Roman emperors ruled with divine aura, mixing theology and politics inseparably. Even later Christians, rejecting Roman gods, adapted this synergy, leadership entwined with divine sanction. Caesar's cult became a prototype both copied and resisted across history. The consequences extended far beyond antiquity. The American founders read Roman history obsessively, seeing Caesar's fall as warning of republics consumed by ambition. Debates between Hamilton and Jefferson were littered with allusions to Caesarism. Napoleon consciously modeled himself upon Caesar, casting his coup as restoration of order amid chaos. Mussolini and Hitler later invoked the same imagery, wielding Rome's aura to justify illiberal power. The shadow of Caesar's assassination stalked every republic thereafter. Liberty's defenders tried to learn from Brutus and Cassius, while ambitious leaders study Caesar and Augustus. Even archaeology underscores the permanence of consequences. Excavations at the Forum reveal a memorial shrine built where Caesar's body burned on a pyre, still visited by Romans with flowers 2 millennia later. Coins declaring Eidimar minted by Brutus became symbols of liberty, ironically preserved in only a handful of specimens, while Caesar's effigied coins flooded the empire. The historical record itself reflects imbalance. Conspirators shouted liberty, but Caesar's name endured. Strategy favors those who shape memory, not merely events. Consider the strategic lenses again. Brutus and Cassius acted like field commanders launching a daring strike against a fortified enemy, but they had no reserve plan, no supply line, no diplomatic preparation. Their assassinations were a raid without reinforcement. Antony and Octavian, by contrast, treated politics like campaign strategy, securing logistics, rallying veterans, seizing propaganda. They did not merely kill or win, they managed aftermath. That is the difference between success and failure, in politics as in war. Tactical brilliance without strategic vision courts ruin. The broader consequence was this: Caesar's assassination froze forever the impossibility of returning to the old republic. The republic depended on elite cooperation, annual rotation, suspicion of monarchic aspiration. By Caesar's time, expansion had rendered such mechanisms obsolete. The Mediterranean-scale empire required single command. His death did not restore the old system, it exposed its corpse. In this truth lies the most sobering lesson: sometimes killing the leader cannot revive the system, because the system itself is already gone. So ask yourself, could Rome ever have remained a republic? Or was Caesar merely the man who admitted reality, that power must consolidate for empire to function? Brutus and Cassius thought they fought for liberty. Perhaps they fought ghosts. Perhaps their daggers cut only symbols, not substance. The consequence reaches even to us. Modern states balancing liberty and executive power grapple with Caesar's choice: to yield temporary strongman authority in crisis, or to preserve cumbersome republican forms. History warns: once power centralizes into one man's hands, removing him rarely stops the process. Caesar's assassination proved removal can accelerate it. Strategy demands not only action but vision for what replaces it. Without that, chaos fills the vacuum, and another stronger figure emerges. Thus, Caesar's fall became Rome's transformation. In blood, the Republic died. In aftermath, empire was born. And in that empire's legacy, law codes, languages, infrastructure, political imagery, we live still. The turning point of Rome birthed consequences that shaped the modern world. Not in bronze statues or marble ruins alone, but in ideas, executive power, military loyalty, propaganda, martyrdom, liberty versus security. Caesar's death was not an ending. It was a beginning. And so the story closes in paradox. The Senate struck to preserve liberty. The consequence was monarchy eternal. Caesar lost his life. Caesarism gained immortality. Why does one assassination in 44 BC still matter today? Because the struggles that killed Caesar were not confined to marble columns. They were struggles of power versus liberty, personal charisma versus fragile institutions, ambition colliding with tradition. These struggles endure wherever republics rise and falter. Caesar's fall, and the night he almost fell earlier, remind us that history turns on hesitation, on pride, on decisions made in moments no grander than a single breath. Consider what we have traced. Caesar rose through brilliance on battlefield and generosity to his men. His victories at Alesia, Pharsalus, Zela, and beyond stitched together a legend feared by foes, adored by veterans. His political clemency spared enemies, yet sowed suspicion. His cultural integration extended citizenship, binding provinces, while games and bread bound city crowds. But it was precisely this combination, military might, political charisma, popular adoration, that convinced senators the Republic was dying. Conspiracies thrived because Caesar embodied not a reformer within the Republic but its replacement. The turning point came not only with daggers, but with hesitation. That earlier night, when ill health or providence delayed Caesar, and conspirators relented, was the lost chance to change history's arc. Instead, his public death created not liberation but martyrdom. Civil wars followed, Augustus rose, and Rome became empire. Strategy teaches us that killing a commander can collapse an army, but only when institutions still matter. By Caesar's day, institutions no longer commanded loyalty. Men and masses had chosen him. His death removed the man but left the structure that bore his name. Out of the Republic's ashes bloomed Caesarism, ruled by one, sustained by legions and loyalists. And that is why his fate matters still. Modern states wrestle with the same dilemma: how to empower leaders strong enough to act, without granting powers broad enough to strangle liberty. Rome shows the danger of imbalance. Let the executive grow too strong, and removal through violence may accelerate monarchy rather than prevent it. Brutus and Cassius discovered this too late. Their daggers carved only Caesar's body, not the machinery that replaced debate with decree. Archaeology confirms how lasting his shadow was. Coins with Caesar's profile flooded the Mediterranean, while Brutus's symbolic, id mar, coin is preserved in only a handful of examples. Monuments to Caesar survived centuries. His shrine in the Forum still receives flowers. His myth endured because he answered needs his republic no longer could: order bred victory. It is hard to fight against memory that feeds the people. Caesar's assassins grasped at liberty, but Caesar's ghost fed Rome Empire. So what lessons can contemporary leaders draw? First, power feeds on perception. Caesar died for appearing to reach for a crown, whether he meant to or not. Leaders today who wield emergency powers, who stretch authority in crisis, remind us of that peril. Second, killing a man is not killing an idea. Caesar's death proved ideas of unity and strength remained alive. If one desires to defend liberty, one must strengthen institutions, not simply eliminate personalities. Third, hesitation defines history. The conspirators' delay produced the exact martyrdom they dreaded. Leaders, too, must grasp that timing is as decisive as action. And yet, there is another lesson for us not as leaders but as citizens. Romans accepted Caesar because daily life felt enriched: bread, games, debt relief, security. Liberty collapsed not only from Caesar's ambition but because the people themselves demanded spectacle over scrutiny. When citizens prize entertainment more than responsibility, republics weaken. It is easy to condemn Brutus or praise Caesar. Harder is to ask, what role did ordinary Romans play in watching liberty wither while cheering a strong man? And what role do citizens today play in safeguarding institutions from similar fates? We end, then, as we began, with questions. Would you have sharpened a dagger beside Brutus, convinced Caesar endangered liberty? Or would you have cheered Caesar's triumphs, content that bread and stability outweighed archaic traditions? Would you have struck him down, or defended him to the end? History will not answer, but it warns. Republics may perish from hesitation, from ambition unchecked, from citizens who value kingship disguised as protection. The night Caesar almost fell, and the day he finally did, reveal one truth as sharp as any gladius: freedom survives not by chance, not by omens, not by daggers, but by vigilance. Rome failed that test. Will others?